The dust swirled across the barren plains like angry ghosts as Quentin Calloway pulled back on the reins of his chestnut stallion. Something caught his eye, a flash of faded blue fabric against the relentless brown of the Wyoming territory. The year was 1878, and this unforgiving land showed no mercy to those who traveled alone. Drawing closer, Quentin's breath caught in his throat. There, half buried in the dirt, lay a woman, her skin pale against the harsh landscape, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "Miss." His voice cracked from disuse. 3 days on the trail had left him with little company besides his horse and the occasional coyote. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer grass. Pain etched lines around her mouth as she tried to move. "Don't," Quentin said, kneeling beside her. "You're hurt." Her lips, cracked and dry, parted slightly. "Water," she whispered. Quentin quickly uncorked his canteen and gently lifted her head, allowing a small trickle to pass between her lips. She coughed, then drank greedily. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." When she'd had enough, he set the canteen aside and assessed her injuries. Besides the clearly broken leg, she had cuts and bruises covering her arms and face. Her dress, once a fine calico, was torn and bloodied. But what struck him most was the determination in her eyes, even through the pain. "What's your name?" he asked. "Katherine," she managed. "Katherine Zimmerman." "I'm Quentin Calloway. What happened to you, Miss Zimmerman?" Katherine closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "Stagecoach. Attacked. 2 days ago, I think. Everyone else. They didn't make it." Quentin's jaw tightened. Bandits had been growing bolder in the territory lately. "How'd you get all the way out here?" "Crawled," she said simply. "Couldn't stay there with them." Something stirred in Quentin's chest: respect, admiration, and something else he couldn't quite name. This woman had dragged herself across miles of harsh terrain with a broken leg rather than give up. "I need to set that leg before we move you," he said. "It's going to hurt something fierce." She nodded, her jaw set. "Do what you must, Mr. Calloway." Quentin returned to his horse for supplies. He'd seen enough injuries in his time as a ranch hand and during the war to know what needed to be done. With 2 straight branches as splints and strips torn from his spare shirt, he prepared to set her leg. "Bite on this," he said, offering her a folded leather strap from his saddlebag, "and hold onto my arm." Katherine took the strap between her teeth and gripped his forearm with surprising strength. Their eyes met, and Quentin saw no fear there, only resolve. "On 3, he said. 1. He moved swiftly on 1, knowing the anticipation was often worse than the pain itself. There was a sickening crack as the bone realigned. Katherine's fingers dug into his arm, and a muffled scream escaped around the leather. But she didn't faint, and she didn't let go. Working quickly, Quentin secured the splints with the fabric strips, creating a crude but effective immobilization. "You did well," he said, gently removing the strap from her mouth. "Better than most men I've seen." "Not my first broken bone," she replied, her voice strained but steady, "though I hope it's my last." Quentin helped her drink more water, then assessed their situation. The nearest town, Cottonwood Springs, was a good day's ride away. Carrying her would slow them down, but there was no choice. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. "I'll have to put you on my horse. It won't be comfortable, but I'll do my best to keep that leg stable." Katherine nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Calloway, I should tell you, I have nothing to pay you with. The bandits took everything." Quentin shook his head. "I'm not looking for payment, Miss Zimmerman. No decent man would leave a woman alone out here." With great care, he lifted her into his arms. Despite days without proper food or water, she wasn't as light as he expected. There was substance to her, a solidity that matched the determination in her eyes. As he settled her onto his horse, Keeping her injured leg as straight as possible, she looked down at him with a curious expression. "Will I walk again, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, a tremor finally breaking through her composure. Quentin looked up at her, the sun behind her head creating a halo of light around her auburn hair. Something about her struck him deep in his soul, a kindred spirit perhaps, someone who understood survival and didn't surrender easily to fate. "You'll walk again beside me, Miss Zimmerman," he said, the words coming from somewhere he didn't quite recognize. "That's a promise." He didn't know why he'd said it that way, as if their paths would remain connected beyond this chance encounter. But as he began leading his horse across the dusty plains, Katherine Zimmerman's hand resting lightly on his shoulder for balance, Quentin felt as though the lonely trail ahead had somehow changed course. The sun beat down mercilessly as Quentin led his horse across the vast, open terrain. Every so often he'd glance up at Katherine, concerned by the pallor of her skin and the way she swayed slightly in the saddle despite her obvious efforts to remain upright. "How much further?" she asked after several hours, her voice thin with pain. "We'll make camp soon," Quentin replied. "Pushing through the night would be too hard on you." Truth was, he was worried. The broken leg alone was serious enough, but she was clearly suffering from exposure and dehydration as well. If infection set in, things could get dire quickly. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Quentin spotted a small copse of cottonwood trees near a shallow creek, a rare blessing in this arid landscape. "We'll stop here," he announced, carefully helping Katherine down from the horse. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as he carried her to the shade of the trees. When he set her down, leaning her back against a trunk, she closed her eyes momentarily, gathering herself. "Thank you," she said simply. Quentin nodded and set about making camp. He unsaddled his horse, allowing the animal to drink from the creek, then collected firewood. All the while, he kept glancing at Katherine, struck by her quiet dignity. Most folks he knew would be wailing or complaining by now. "How'd you end up on that stagecoach, Miss Zimmerman?" he asked as he worked, hoping conversation might distract her from the pain. Katherine shifted slightly, wincing. "I was a teacher in Boston. I accepted a position at a new school in Silver Creek." Quentin raised an eyebrow. "Silver Creek? That's hard country for a city woman." A spark flashed in her eyes. "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Calloway." "Clearly," he conceded with a small smile. "Most folks with a broken leg wouldn't have made it half as far as you did." "I didn't have much choice," she said softly. "When the bandits left, there was so much blood. The driver, the guard, an elderly couple, all gone. I couldn't stay there with them." Quentin paused in his work, recognizing the haunted look in her eyes. He'd seen it often enough after the war, the gaze of someone who'd witnessed too much death. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. Katherine looked down at her hands. "I kept thinking about the children waiting for their new teacher. Silly, isn't it, to worry about that when I was dragging myself through the dust?" "Not silly at all," Quentin replied, struck by her selflessness. "It gave you something to hold on to." As darkness fell, he built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky from his provisions. Katherine ate little, but seemed to gain some strength from the hot food and coffee. "What about you?" she asked, watching him over the rim of her tin cup. "What brings you out here alone?" Quentin poked at the fire with a stick, considering his answer. "I'm heading to my brother's ranch near Cottonwood Springs. Been working cattle drives for the past few years, but Daniel's offered me a partnership in his place." "You don't sound entirely convinced about it," Katherine observed perceptively. Quentin chuckled. "That obvious, huh? Truth is, I've been drifting so long I'm not sure I remember how to stay put." "The war?" she asked quietly. He looked up sharply. "How'd you know?" "My father and brothers fought," she explained. They came back different, restless. "Yes, madam, the war." Quentin didn't elaborate and Katherine didn't press. As the fire burned down to embers, Quentin arranged his bedroll for Katherine, insisting she take it while he made do with his saddle as a pillow. Before settling down for the night, he checked her splint and gave her another small dose of the whiskey he carried for medicinal purposes. "To help with the pain," he explained. Katherine grimaced at the taste but thanked him. As he turned to move away, she caught his hand. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice low, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Quentin knelt beside her, the firelight casting shadows across her face, highlighting the strength in her features despite her weakened state. "What is it?" he asked. "If my leg—" "If it doesn't heal properly," she said, her voice steady despite the fear behind her words, "will I still be able to teach? To support myself?" Quentin considered her question carefully. It would be easy to offer false reassurance, but something told him Katherine Zimmerman wasn't a woman who appreciated being coddled. "I won't lie to you," he said finally. "It might not heal perfectly without proper medical attention. But I've known men who have returned to hard ranch work with worse injuries. Teaching shouldn't be impossible, even if you're left with a limp." Katherine nodded, seemingly satisfied with his honesty. "Thank you. I'd rather know what I'm facing than be spared the truth." As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, Quentin remained awake, keeping watch. The territory was dangerous enough by day. At night, both human predators and animal ones posed threats. Under the vast canopy of stars, Quentin found his thoughts returning to the woman sleeping nearby. He'd encountered plenty of hardy frontier women in his travels, but something about Katherine was different. Perhaps it was the contrast between her refined Boston background and the raw determination she'd shown. Or maybe it was the way she'd looked at him when he promised she'd walk again, as if his words alone were something she could hold on to. Whatever it was, Quentin realized with some surprise that, for the first time in years, he was genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke with a crimson splash across the eastern sky. Quentin, who had dozed only fitfully throughout the night, rose to check on Katherine. Her forehead felt warm to his touch, too warm. A fever was setting in, just as he'd feared. "Miss Zimmerman," he said gently, shaking her shoulder. "Katherine." She stirred, her eyes opening but seeming unfocused. "Water," she murmured. Quentin helped her drink, noting the unnatural brightness of her eyes and the flush across her cheekbones. They needed to reach town and a doctor as quickly as possible. "We need to move," he told her. "Think you can manage another day on horseback?" Katherine nodded, though the simple movement seemed to cause her pain. "I can manage." Quentin packed up their meager camp swiftly, then carefully lifted Katherine onto his horse again. She was definitely warmer than she should be, and she leaned more heavily against him than she had the day before. "Hold on," he instructed, mounting behind her this time. It would slow them down with the double weight on his horse, but Katherine clearly couldn't sit upright on her own anymore. She nodded, leaning back against his chest as he urged the horse forward. Quentin tried to ignore the strange feeling that coursed through him at the contact. This wasn't the time for such thoughts. They rode steadily through the morning, Quentin keeping the pace as smooth as possible to avoid jarring Katherine's leg. Around midday, when the sun was at its most punishing, she began to mumble incoherently, her head rolling against his shoulder. "Katherine," he said firmly, using her first name without thinking. "Stay with me now, the children," she murmured. "They're waiting, I promised." "You'll get to them," Quentin assured her, worry gnawing at his insides. "Just hold on a bit longer." By mid-afternoon, she was fully delirious, alternating between calling out for people Quentin didn't know and falling into an uneasy doze against him. He urged his tired horse faster, knowing they were both running out of time. Just as the sun was beginning its western descent, the scattered buildings of Cottonwood Springs appeared on the horizon. Relief flooded through Quentin, though he knew they weren't safe yet. "Almost there," he told Katherine, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Just a little further." Cottonwood Springs was small as frontier towns when a main street lined with the usual establishments: general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a small hotel. Quentin headed straight for the doctor's office, a modest clapboard building near the edge of town. He dismounted carefully, keeping Katherine steady on the horse, then lifted her into his arms. She felt lighter than before, as if the fever was burning away at her substance. Dr. Samuel Wells, a graying man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, opened the door at Quentin's knock. "What have we here?" he asked, ushering them inside. "Found her in the plains yesterday," Quentin explained quickly. "Stagecoach attack, broken leg, and now fever's set in bad." The doctor nodded grimly, gesturing toward an examination table. "Set her down here. How long ago was the break?" "She said the attack was 2 days before I found her, so 3 days now," Quentin replied, carefully placing Katherine on the table. She moaned softly but didn't open her eyes. Dr. Wells cut away the makeshift splint and examined the leg, his expression growing more concerned. "Compound fracture." "You said it," Quentin nodded. "Did what I could out there." "You did well," the doctor acknowledged, "but there's infection setting in. We'll need to clean it thoroughly and reset it properly." He looked up at Quentin. "It's going to be painful. You might want to wait outside." "I'll stay," Quentin said firmly. "She's got no one else." The doctor gave him a curious look but didn't argue. "Very well. Help me get these dirty clothes off her. We need to check for other injuries too." Together, they removed Katherine's torn dress, leaving her in her undergarments for modesty's sake. Besides the broken leg, she had numerous cuts and abrasions, several of which were showing signs of infection. "Poor woman's been through hell," Dr. Wells muttered. "Fetch that basin of water and those clean rags. We need to cool her down while I prepare for the procedure." Quentin did as instructed, gently bathing Katherine's face and arms with cool water. As he worked, her eyes fluttered open, momentarily clear. "Quentin," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "I'm here," he replied, taking her hand. "We made it to town. The doctor's going to fix your leg proper." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You kept your promise." Before Quentin could respond, Dr. Wells returned with his instruments and a bottle of chloroform. "This will put her under," he explained. "Much more humane than whiskey and a leather strap." Quentin nodded, but kept hold of Katherine's hand as the doctor administered the anesthetic. Her grip remained surprisingly strong until the chloroform took effect, and then her fingers went slack in his. "I need to ask," Dr. Wells said as he prepared to clean the wound. "Is she your wife, or—" "No," Quentin replied quickly. "Just someone who needed help." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Well, she's lucky you found her. Not many would have stopped for a stranger." Quentin stayed throughout the procedure, watching as Dr. Wells cleaned the wound, realigned the bone more precisely, and secured it with a proper splint. The doctor also treated her other injuries, applying salves and bandages where needed. "She'll need complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks," Dr. Wells said when he'd finished. "Then limited movement with crutches. The fever should break once the infection clears, but we'll need to watch her closely for the next few days." "Can she stay here?" Quentin asked. The doctor shook his head. "I don't have proper facilities for long-term care." "The hotel would be your best option, though someone will need to look after her." Quentin hesitated only briefly. "I'll see to it," he said. "My brother's expecting me, but he'll understand the delay." Dr. Wells studied him curiously, That's quite a commitment for a stranger, Mr. Calloway. Quentin looked down at Catherine's pale face, peaceful now in unconsciousness. I gave her my word she'd walk again, he said simply. I aim to keep it. After settling the doctor's fee, Quentin carefully wrapped Katherine in a clean blanket and carried her to the town's modest hotel. Mrs. Abigail Foster, the no-nonsense widow who ran the establishment, raised her eyebrows at the sight of them but asked no questions when Quentin explained the situation. Room at the end of the hall, she said, handing him a key. It's quieter there. I'll send up some broth when she wakes and extra linens for the fever. Thank you, madam, Quentin replied, grateful for the woman's practicality. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and single chair. Quentin gently laid Katherine on the bed, arranging pillows to elevate her injured leg as the doctor had instructed. As he settled into the chair for what promised to be another long night, Quentin found himself wondering about the turn his journey had taken. He'd set out for his brother's ranch expecting a straightforward ride and decisions about his future. Instead, he'd found himself responsible for a woman he barely knew, yet felt inexplicably connected to. Katherine stirred slightly in her drug-induced sleep, her brow furrowing as if troubled by dreams. Without thinking, Quentin reached out and smoothed a strand of auburn hair from her forehead. Rest easy, he murmured. You're safe now. And as the last light of day faded from the window, Quentin Calloway realized that for the first time since the war, he felt anchored to something beyond his own restless wandering. The fever raged for 3 days. Quentin rarely left Katherine's side, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, coaxing water between her parched lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, and changing the dressings on her leg as Dr. Wells had shown him. Mrs. Foster brought food that Quentin barely touched and fresh linens that were soon soaked with sweat. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Quentin dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside the bed, a soft voice pulled him from his troubled sleep. You're still here. He straightened immediately, finding Katherine watching him with clear eyes for the first time since they'd reached town. The unnatural flush had faded from her cheeks, and though she looked exhausted, the confusion of fever had left her gaze. The fever's broken, Quentin said, relief evident in his voice as he pressed a hand to her forehead to confirm what he could see. How long? She asked, her voice raspy from disuse. 3 days, he replied, helping her sip water from a cup on the nightstand. Had me worried there for a while. Katherine drank gratefully, then settled back against the pillows. You stayed all this time, Quentin nodded, suddenly self-conscious under her steady gaze. Couldn't very well leave you to fend for yourself. A small smile touched her lips. Most men would have dropped me with the doctor and considered their duty done. I'm not most men, Quentin replied simply. No, she agreed softly. You're not. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with something neither was ready to name. You should eat something, Quentin said finally, breaking the tension. Mrs. Foster keeps sending up soup, says you need to get your strength back. Katherine nodded, allowing him to help her sit up more fully against the pillows. The movement clearly caused her pain, but she made no complaint as Quentin retrieved a bowl of chicken broth that had been kept warm on the small stove in the corner. As she ate slowly, Quentin found himself studying her in the lamplight. With the grime of the trail washed away and some color returning to her face, Katherine Zimmerman was a strikingly beautiful woman. Her auburn hair, which Mrs. Foster had helped to wash and braid during one of Quentin's brief absences, framed a face of classical proportions. But it was her eyes that held his attention, intelligent, determined, and somehow both vulnerable and strong at once. Tell me about the school in Silver Creek, he said, wanting to hear her voice more than anything. Katherine's face brightened subtly. It's new. The town raised money for a proper schoolhouse after years of children learning in the back of the church. They wrote to my teaching college in Boston seeking someone with experience. And you were willing to leave city comforts for frontier life? Quentin asked, genuinely curious. A shadow passed over her features. There wasn't much holding me in Boston anymore. My parents passed last winter within weeks of each other. My brothers have their own families. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue, and I had recently ended an engagement. I'm sorry, Quentin said, though a part of him wasn't sorry at all that she wasn't married or promised to anyone. Katherine shrugged slightly. Don't be. Edward was suitable, the son of my father's business partner. It was more arrangement than romance. She looked down at her soup. When I received the letter from Silver Creek, it felt like an opportunity to start fresh, to be something more than a suitable match. Quentin nodded, understanding the desire to forge one's own path all too well. Brave decision. Some called it foolish, she said with a small smile. Perhaps they were right, considering how my journey has gone so far. You're alive, Quentin pointed out. That's more than can be said for the others on that stagecoach. I'd say that speaks to wisdom rather than foolishness. Katherine considered this, then changed the subject. You mentioned your brother's ranch. Will he be worried about your delay? Daniel's used to me showing up when I show up, Quentin replied. But I should probably send word. I'll go to the telegraph office tomorrow. You don't need to stay in town on my account, Katherine said, though something in her eyes suggested she hoped he would. I'm sure Mrs. Foster could look in on me. Quentin shook his head. I made you a promise, remember, that you'd walk again beside me. Can't very well keep that if I'm miles away at the ranch. The smile that spread across Katherine's face was like sunrise after a long night. I remember, she said softly. I thought I might have dreamed it. No dream, Quentin assured her. Though I admit, I'm not entirely sure why I said it that way. Seemed right at the time. It gave me something to hold on to, she admitted. During the fever, I kept hearing your voice telling me I'd walk again. Their eyes met, and Quentin felt something shift between them, a connection deepening beyond the circumstance that had brought them together. Before he could respond, however, there was a knock at the door. It was Dr. Wells, come to check on his patient. The doctor seemed pleased with Katherine's improvement, pronouncing the fever vanquished and the leg healing as well as could be expected. You'll need to stay off it completely for at least another week, he instructed. Then we can try crutches for short periods. The bone will take months to fully heal, but with proper care, you should regain most, if not all, of your mobility. Thank you, Doctor, Katherine said. And when might I be able to continue to Silver Creek? Dr. Wells frowned. That's a rough journey even for someone in perfect health, Miss Zimmerman. I wouldn't recommend attempting it for at least 2 months, possibly more. Katherine's face fell visibly. But the school term begins in 3 weeks. They're expecting me. I'm sorry, the doctor said firmly. Even if we got you on a stagecoach, the jostling alone could undo all the healing. You need time and rest. After the doctor left, Katherine sat in silence, staring at the wall. Quentin could see the disappointment etched in every line of her face. The school will understand, he offered gently. They can find a temporary replacement. They already waited months for me to arrive, Katherine said, her voice tight with frustration. What if they give the position to someone else permanently? What then? I've used nearly all my savings getting here. Quentin considered the problem. What if I send a telegram to Silver Creek? Explain the situation, let them know you're still coming, just delayed. Hope flickered in her eyes. Would you do that? First thing tomorrow, he promised. Katherine reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you, Quentin, for everything. The simple touch of her hand on his sent an unexpected warmth through him. Quentin had known many women in his years of wandering, but none had affected him quite like Katherine Zimmerman with her quiet strength and determination. "Try to rest now," he said, gently withdrawing his hand. Doctor's orders. As Katherine drifted back to sleep, Quentin stood by the window, looking out at the quiet town. His life had been directionless for so long, moving from job to job, place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments. Now, suddenly, he found himself bound to this woman's recovery, to her future. And strangely, the thought didn't fill him with the familiar urge to move on. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The next morning, Quentin sent 2 telegrams, one to his brother explaining his delay, and one to the town council of Silver Creek regarding Katherine's situation. While waiting for replies, he purchased a few necessities for Katherine with money from his modest savings. A nightgown, some personal items Mrs. Foster had suggested, and a book of poetry he'd noticed her eyeing in the general store window when he'd carried her past it. Katherine's face lit up when he presented the small gifts. "You didn't have to do this," she said, fingers tracing the embossed cover of the book. "Figured you'd get bored staring at these 4 walls," Quentin replied with a shrug, though her pleasure warmed something inside him. Later that afternoon, responses arrived to both telegrams. Daniel expressed concern but understanding, inviting Quentin to bring the schoolteacher to the ranch when she was well enough to travel. The reply from Silver Creek was equally positive. They would arrange a temporary teacher and hold the position for Katherine until she recovered. "They're still waiting for me," Katherine said, relief evident in her voice as Quentin read her the telegram. "I haven't lost everything after all." "Told you it would work out," Quentin said, settling into the chair beside her bed. It had become his customary spot over the past days, and despite its discomfort, he found himself reluctant to be anywhere else. "You did," she acknowledged. "You seem to have a habit of being right about things." Quentin chuckled. "Don't let my brother hear you say that. He'd tell you I've been wrong-headed my whole life." "Tell me about him," Katherine requested. "About your family." Quentin hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, preferring to leave painful memories buried. But something about Katherine's genuine interest broke through his usual reticence. "Daniel's my older brother by 4 years," he began. "Always was the sensible one. When the war came, he stayed to run the family ranch while I enlisted. Our parents died while I was away, influenza." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. Quentin nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "When I came back, I couldn't settle. Everything felt wrong somehow. Daniel understood, or tried to. He kept the ranch going, got married, started a family. I just kept moving." "And now he's offering you a partnership," Katherine observed. "He must value you greatly." "More likely he needs the help," Quentin replied. "His oldest boy's only 12, and good ranch hands are hard to find these days." "Is that the only reason you're considering it?" Katherine asked perceptively. "Because he needs help," Quentin considered the question. "Partly," he admitted. "But I'm getting tired of drifting, seeing the same stars every night but never feeling at home beneath them." Katherine nodded as if she understood perfectly. "The stars were different in Boston," she said. "Dimmer, fewer. Out here they're so bright it almost hurts to look at them. I thought I might feel small beneath such a vast sky, but instead I feel possible. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Quentin replied, struck by how accurately she'd captured his own feelings about the Western Territories. "That's why folks keep coming out here, I reckon. Possibility." As the days passed, Katherine grew stronger. True to his word, Quentin remained in town, taking odd jobs to supplement his dwindling funds. He spent most evenings in Katherine's room, reading aloud from her poetry book or telling stories of his travels while she worked on mending some second-hand clothing, Mrs. Foster had provided. A week after the fever broke, Dr. Wells deemed Katherine ready to try crutches. Quentin fashioned a pair from pine wood, carefully sanding the handles smooth so they wouldn't chafe her palms. "Ready?" he asked, standing beside the bed as Katherine prepared for her first attempt at standing since the injury. She nodded, determination written across her features. With Quentin's steady hands supporting her, Katherine swung her legs over the side of the bed, keeping the injured one straight as instructed. She winced as blood rushed to the limb, but didn't falter. "Easy now," Quentin cautioned, positioning the crutches under her arms. "Just a few steps today." Katherine's face was a study in concentration as she took her first halting step, then another. Quentin stayed close, ready to catch her if she faltered. "I'm doing it," she breathed, a smile breaking across her face as she made it halfway across the small room. "You surely are," Quentin agreed, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. "Knew you would." Katherine looked up at him, joy and pain mingled in her expression. "You're keeping your promise." Something in her gaze caused Quentin's heart to trip over itself. Before he could respond, however, Katherine's strength gave out. Her good leg buckled and she pitched forward with a small cry. Quentin caught her against his chest, the crutches clattering to the floor. For a moment they stood frozen, Katherine supported entirely by his arms, her face mere inches from his. Quentin could feel her breath, quick and warm against his chin, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I've got you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You always seem to," she replied softly. Neither moved for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then, with careful hands, Quentin helped her back to the bed. "That was very good for a first try," he said, retreating to safer conversational ground. "Doctor said to take it slow, though. Don't want to rush and set yourself back." Katherine nodded, though her eyes remained on his face, studying him in a way that made him both uncomfortable and exhilarated. "Quentin," she said after a moment, "may I ask you something personal?" He hesitated, then nodded. "You can ask." "Why did you really stay? The truth." Quentin looked away, gathering his thoughts. It was a question he'd been asking himself with increasing frequency. "At first it was duty," he said finally, meeting her eyes again. "You needed help and I couldn't in good conscience leave you alone." "And now," Katherine pressed gently, Quentin took a deep breath. "Now, I stay because the thought of leaving feels wrong. Because when I imagine riding away from this town, I can't picture it without seeing you beside me." He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "I don't have a better answer than that." Katherine's expression softened. "That's a very good answer, Quentin Calloway." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. It was Mrs. Foster with dinner trays and news that the town was organizing a social at the end of the week. "Doctor says you're well enough to attend if you feel up to it, Miss Zimmerman," the landlady announced. "Mighty you good to get out of this room for an evening." After Mrs. Foster left, Katherine turned to Quentin with unexpected enthusiasm. "A social would be wonderful." "I've been cooped up for so long." Quentin shifted uncomfortably. "Never been one for town gatherings." "Please?" Katherine asked. "It would be my first real outing and I'd feel safer with you there." Put that way, Quentin couldn't refuse. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "But don't expect any dancing from me." Katherine laughed, the sound like music in the small room. "I believe I'm the one who's temporarily excused from dancing, Mr. Calloway." The night of the social arrived clear and mild. Quentin had purchased a new shirt for the occasion and suffered through a proper haircut at the town barber's insistence. When he knocked on Katherine's door, he felt unusually nervous, as if this were something more significant than simply escorting an injured woman to a town gathering. The door opened to reveal Katherine in a borrowed dress of deep blue calico. Mrs. Foster had helped arrange her hair in a becoming style, with soft curls framing her face. She stood steadily on her crutches, her injured leg still splinted but hidden beneath the folds of her skirt. "You look—" Quentin cleared his throat. "You look very nice, Miss Zimmerman." A blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. And I think, after all we've been through, you might call me Katherine all the time now." "Katherine," he repeated, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The social was held in the town hall, a simple building that served multiple purposes for the community. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the gathering. A small band played in one corner, and tables laden with food lined the walls. As they entered, conversation briefly halted as curious eyes turned toward them. Quentin felt Katherine tense beside him and instinctively drew closer to her. "It's all right," he murmured. "Just folks wondering about the strangers. Doctor." Wells approached them first, greeting Katherine warmly and expressing pleasure at her recovery. This broke the ice, and soon others came forward to introduce themselves. Katherine charmed them effortlessly, her Eastern education and natural warmth winning over even the most reserved townspeople. Quentin stayed close, watching with admiration as she navigated the social interactions despite her physical discomfort. Several times she caught his eye across a conversation, her smile seeming meant only for him. As the evening progressed, Quentin found himself cornered by the town's mayor, a portly man named Harold Jenkins. "Fine woman. You're Miss Zimmerman," Jenkins commented, nursing a glass of punch. "Shame about her position in Silver Creek. We could use a teacher of her caliber here in Cottonwood Springs." Quentin raised an eyebrow. "You don't have a school teacher." Jenkins shook his head ruefully. "Lost ours to marriage last spring. Been making do with the preacher's wife, but she's expecting and won't be able to continue much longer." He gave Quentin a speculative look. "Might be worth mentioning to Miss Zimmerman. We can't offer much, but it's closer than Silver Creek and she'd be mighty welcome." Quentin nodded noncommittally, though his mind raced with the implications. Cottonwood Springs was just a few hours' ride from Daniel's ranch, while Silver Creek was nearly 2 days away. Across the room, he saw Katherine seated with a group of women, laughing at something one had said. She looked up, as if sensing his gaze, and smiled in a way that made his chest tighten. Later, as the band played a slow waltz, Quentin found himself standing beside Katherine's chair, watching couples move across the floor. "Wish you could dance?" he asked. Katherine tilted her head, considering. "Not particularly. I've never been very graceful, even with 2 good legs." She glanced up at him. "What about you? Any hidden dancing talents I should know about?" Quentin chuckled. "None whatsoever, though." He hesitated, then offered his hand. "We could try something if you're willing." Curiosity lit her eyes as she placed her hand in his. With careful movements, Quentin helped her to stand, supporting most of her weight. "Put your foot on top of mine," he instructed softly. "I'll do the moving for both of us." Katherine complied, balancing on her good leg with one hand on his shoulder, the other clasped in his. Slowly, Quentin began to move, taking tiny steps in time with the music, bearing Katherine's weight as if it were nothing. They weren't truly dancing, more like swaying in place, but Katherine's face glowed with pleasure as they moved together in their small corner of the room. "Not quite walking beside you yet," she murmured, "but it's a start." Quentin looked down at her upturned face, at the trust, and something deeper shining in her eyes, and knew with sudden clarity that he was falling in love with Katherine Zimmerman. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. As summer eased toward autumn, Katherine's recovery progressed steadily. She graduated from crutches to a walking stick, her movements becoming more confident with each passing day. Quentin remained in Cottonwood Springs, taking work at the livery stable to earn his keep while continuing to help with her rehabilitation. They fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings, Quentin would work while Katherine practiced walking increasingly longer distances. Afternoons often found them sitting on the hotel's small porch, reading or talking as the sun made its way across the sky. Evenings were spent sharing simple meals and conversations that stretched late into the night. Neither spoke directly of the growing feelings between them, though they manifested in 100 small ways, a lingering touch when Quentin helped Katherine navigate a difficult step. The way her eyes sought his whenever something amused her, how he'd taken to carrying wildflowers back from his rides outside town. One particularly fine September afternoon, Quentin borrowed a wagon from the livery stable owner and prepared a surprise. "Where are we going?" Katherine asked as he helped her up onto the seat. "You'll see," Quentin replied with an uncharacteristic smile. "Doctor says you need to build your strength with regular exercise." He drove them out of town, following the creek that gave Cottonwood Springs its name. After about a mile, the trees thickened, providing welcome shade. Quentin stopped the wagon in a small clearing beside the water, where he'd earlier prepared a simple picnic. "Oh, Quentin," Katherine breathed, taking in the scene. "It's beautiful." He helped her down, steadying her as she found her footing on the uneven ground. With her walking stick and his arm to lean on, Katherine made her way to the blanket he'd spread beneath a large cottonwood. "This is the furthest I've been from town since arriving," she said, settling carefully onto the blanket. "I'd almost forgotten what it feels like to be away from buildings and people." Quentin unpacked the food, bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a jar of Mrs. Foster's preserves. "Thought you might be getting restless. I know I was." Katherine accepted the plate he offered her. "Have you heard from your brother lately?" Quentin nodded. "Got a letter yesterday. He's still holding the partnership for me." He hesitated, then added, "He asked when we might be arriving." Katherine repeated, a question in her voice. Quentin felt his face warm. "His assumption, not mine." "Seems the whole town has decided there's more between us than there is." "And what is between us, Quentin?" Katherine asked softly, setting aside her plate. "We've never really spoken of it." Quentin looked out at the creek, gathering his courage. He'd faced Confederate bullets with less trepidation than this conversation. "I care for you," he said finally, meeting her eyes. "More than I've cared for anyone in a very long time. Maybe ever." Katherine's expression softened. "I care for you too." "But you have your position in Silver Creek," Quentin continued. "Your fresh start. I wouldn't ask you to give that up." Katherine was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the blanket. "Mayor Jenkins spoke to me last week," she said. "Offered me the teaching position here in Cottonwood Springs." Quentin tried to keep his expression neutral, though his heart had begun to race. "Did he now? And what did you tell him?" "That I needed time to consider," she replied. "I made a commitment to Silver Creek. I don't take that lightly." "Of course not," Quentin agreed, admiring her integrity even as he hoped she might choose to stay closer. "But," Katherine continued, her eyes meeting his, "I also need to consider what would make me happy, what future I truly want." The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Quentin reached across the blanket and took her hand in his. "And what future is that, Katherine?" She turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. "One where I don't have to choose between my calling and the man I've come to love." The word hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Quentin felt as though something long frozen inside him had suddenly thawed. "You love me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine nodded, her eyes steady on his despite the blush coloring her cheeks. "I do. Though I understand if you don't." Quentin cut her off by leaning forward and pressing his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, but held all the tenderness he couldn't yet put into words. When he pulled back, Katherine was looking at him with wonder. "Does that mean?" "It means I love you too," Quentin said simply. "Have for a while now, just didn't know how to say it." Joy spread across Katherine's face like sunrise. "So what do we do now?" Quentin considered the question seriously. I think we should consider Mayor Jenkins' offer. Cottonwood Springs needs a teacher. My brother's ranch is nearby. We could build something here." Katherine repeated, this time with a smile. "If you'll have me," Quentin replied, suddenly unsure. "I know I'm not much a drifter with more past than prospects, but I do right by you, Katherine." "I swear it." Katherine reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "You are far more than you give yourself credit for, Quentin Calloway. And yes, I'll have you if you're asking what I think you're asking." Quentin turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Katherine Zimmerman. Not right away, we should court properly first, do things right. But someday when you're ready." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to courting, yes to someday, yes to building something here together." They sealed this new promise with another kiss, longer this time, sweet with the knowledge that it was just the first of many to come. As the afternoon light filtered through the cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows across the blanket, Quentin and Katherine began making plans, practical discussions of housing and finances, interspersed with dreams of a shared future. "I should write to Silver Creek," Katherine said. "Explain my decision. I hope they'll understand." "We can send the telegram tomorrow," Quentin replied. "And I'll need to talk to Daniel, make firm arrangements about the partnership." Katherine nodded, then grew thoughtful. "Quentin, there's something I haven't told you about my past. Something you should know before we go any further." Concern flickered across his features. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "The engagement I broke in Boston. It wasn't entirely my decision. Edward discovered I couldn't." She paused, gathering courage. "The doctors believe I can't have children. There was an illness when I was younger." Quentin was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "And Edward ended things because of that?" Katherine nodded, not meeting his eyes. "His family expected heirs. When I told him, he said he couldn't proceed with the marriage." She looked up finally, vulnerability clear in her gaze. "I understand if this changes things for you as well." Quentin's expression softened as he took both her hands in his. "Katherine, I've spent years believing I'd never have a family of any kind. Meeting you changed that. Whether we have children of our own or not doesn't matter to me. You matter." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. "You're certain?" "Completely," Quentin assured her. "Besides, as a teacher, you'll have dozens of children in your care. And there are always little ones who need homes." He smiled gently. "We'll build our family however it comes to us." Katherine leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "How did I get so fortunate, finding you in all this vastness?" "I believe I found you," Quentin reminded her with a smile. "Limp and alone in the dust. And promised I'd walk beside you," Katherine completed the thought. "Look at us now." Indeed, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Katherine stood with Quentin's support and took several steps along the creek bank, her movements growing steadier with each passing day. Together, they watched the water flow past, contemplating the journey that had brought them to this moment and the future stretching before them. The following weeks were busy with preparations. Katherine accepted the teaching position in Cottonwood Springs, sending her regrets to Silver Creek, along with a recommendation for another teacher from her college. Quentin formalized his partnership with Daniel, riding out to the ranch several times to discuss terms and begin learning the operation. By mid-October, arrangements were complete for Katherine to begin teaching after the harvest break. The town council had secured a small cabin for her near the schoolhouse, proper and respectable for a single woman, yet close enough to the center of town that Quentin could call on her regularly during their courtship. The day before Katherine was to move from the hotel to her new home, Quentin rode back from his brother's ranch with news. "Daniel's invited us for Sunday dinner," he told her as they walked slowly down the town's main street, Katherine's hand resting lightly on his arm for support. Her limp was still pronounced but improving daily. "Says it's high time he met the woman who's reformed his wayward brother." Katherine laughed. "I'm not sure reformed is the right word. Captured might be more accurate." Quentin smiled down at her. "Willingly captured, I assure you." His expression grew more serious. "There's something else. Daniel mentioned that the old Parson place is coming available. It's a small homestead about halfway between town and the ranch. Nothing fancy but sound construction, good water. Might be something to consider for the future." Katherine's eyes widened slightly as she caught his meaning. "For after we're married, you mean?" Quentin nodded, suddenly nervous. "If you'd like it, we could look at it together this weekend after meeting Daniel and his family." "I'd like that very much," Katherine replied, squeezing his arm gently. As they continued their walk, several townspeople greeted them warmly. In the short time since the social, Katherine had become something of a favorite in Cottonwood Springs. Her education and Eastern refinement, combined with the genuine warmth of her character, had endeared her to many. The dramatic story of her rescue and recovery, which had grown somewhat exaggerated in the telling, only added to the community's investment in the couple's happiness. "Miss Zimmerman," called Mrs. Jenkins, the mayor's wife, hurrying across the street toward them. "I've just been to your cabin with some curtains for the windows. And Mr. Calloway, my herald, wants a word when you have a moment, something about building additional shelves in the schoolhouse." Quentin tipped his hat to the bustling woman. "Much obliged, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll stop by this afternoon." After she had moved on, Katherine glanced up at Quentin with amusement. "It seems we're being thoroughly adopted by Cottonwood Springs." "Appears that way," Quentin agreed, somewhat bemused by the community's embracing of them both. After years of passing through towns as a stranger, the experience of being welcomed as a permanent resident was both foreign and unexpectedly pleasant. They reached the general store, where Katherine needed to purchase supplies for her new home. As Quentin held the door for her, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A stagecoach had arrived, an unexpected event, as the regular service wasn't due until the following day. "Wonder what that's about," Quentin mused as they watched several passengers disembark. One figure in particular stood out, a well-dressed man who surveyed the town with obvious distaste before speaking sharply to the driver about his luggage. Something about his bearing seemed vaguely familiar to Quentin, though he was certain he'd never seen the man before. Katherine had gone very still beside him. "It can't be," she whispered. Quentin looked down at her, concerned by the sudden pallor of her face. "Katherine, what is it?" Before she could answer, the stranger spotted them and strode purposefully in their direction. As he drew closer, Quentin could see he was perhaps 35, with the sort of handsome features that spoke of generations of careful breeding. His clothes were expensive, if dusty from travel, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. "Katherine," the man called, stopping a few feet away. "Thank God I've found you." "Edward," Katherine's voice was barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Quentin felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Edward, Katherine's former fiancé from Boston, the man who had rejected her over her inability to bear children. "I've come to bring you home, of course," Edward replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He glanced dismissively at Quentin. "Who is this?" Katherine seemed to gather herself, straightening despite the support of her walking stick. "This is Quentin Calloway. He saved my life after the stagecoach attack." She paused, then added with quiet firmness, "We're engaged to be married." Edward's expression shifted from surprise to something like pity. "Katherine, you can't be serious. You've obviously been through a terrible ordeal. You're not thinking clearly." Quentin felt a slow burn of anger building in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. This was Katherine's battle to fight first. "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have," Katherine replied. "Now please explain why you've traveled all this way, Edward. Our engagement ended months ago by your choice." Edward had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I made a terrible mistake. After you left, I couldn't stop thinking about you. My family agrees that our compatibility outweighs other considerations." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm prepared to accept the situation, Katherine. We can still have the life we planned." Quentin watched Katherine's face, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Would the pull of her former life, the comfort and security Edward represented, be stronger than what they'd found together? Katherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Edward and Quentin. Then, with deliberate movement, she shifted her hand from Quentin's arm to his, interlacing their fingers. "I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Edward," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've found my home here. I've found love here. Real love, not convenience or compatibility." Relief flooded through Quentin, followed quickly by a surge of pride in Katherine's strength and certainty. Edward's face hardened. "This is absurd. Look at you, injured, stranded in this primitive settlement. What kind of life can you possibly have here? What can this man offer you that I cannot?" Katherine's grip on Quentin's hand tightened. "Acceptance, respect, partnership." She looked up at Quentin, her eyes full of emotion. "He found me broken and promised I would walk again beside him, and I am, Edward. I'm walking a path I've chosen freely, with a man who loves me completely for who I am." Edward's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a cold disdain. "I see the West has already corrupted your sensibilities. When you come to your senses, don't expect my offer to still stand." With that, he turned and strode back toward the stagecoach. "I don't believe he'll be staying in town after all," Katherine observed dryly, though Quentin could feel a slight tremor in her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly as they watched Edward berate the stagecoach driver about his return journey. Katherine took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, sounding almost surprised at her own answer. "Yes, I truly am." Quentin studied her face, searching for any hint of regret or uncertainty. Finding none, he brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Katherine Zimmerman," he said simply. "And I love you, Quentin Calloway," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "Now, I believe we have supplies to purchase for my new home." As they entered the general store together, leaving Edward and the ghosts of Katherine's past behind, Quentin marveled at the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in the vast emptiness of the plains had led to this, a future neither could have imagined, but both now embraced with open hearts. The Sunday dinner at Daniel Calloway's ranch marked a significant milestone in Quentin and Katherine's courtship. Daniel, a broader, more weathered version of his younger brother, welcomed Katherine with genuine warmth. His wife, Sarah, immediately took Katherine under her wing, while their 3 children, Robert, Emma, and young Thomas, quickly overcame their initial shyness. "So you're the schoolteacher who's finally managed to tame my wild brother," Daniel remarked during dinner, his eyes twinkling with good humor. "I wouldn't say tamed," Katherine replied with a smile. "Perhaps persuaded to pause long enough to consider the merits of staying in one place." Laughter rippled around the table. Quentin, watching Katherine charm his family with her intelligence and gentle wit, felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what he'd been searching for all those restless years on the trail, not just a place to belong, but people to belong with. After dinner, while Sarah and Katherine discussed plans for the upcoming school term, all three Calloway children would be attending. Daniel took Quentin outside to the porch. "She's a fine woman, Quinn," Daniel said, using the childhood nickname Quentin hadn't heard in years. "Got spirit and smarts. Reminds me of Ma in some ways." "Highest compliment you could give," Quentin replied, knowing how deeply both brothers had admired their mother's strength and wisdom. Daniel nodded, looking out over the ranch that had been in their family for 2 generations. "You're serious about settling down then? No more wandering?" "I'm sure," Quentin said without hesitation. "Been running long enough." "From what?" Daniel asked quietly. It was a question he'd never directly posed before, though Quentin knew his brother had wondered about the restlessness that had driven him since the war. Quentin considered his answer carefully. "From myself, mostly. From feeling like I didn't deserve a normal life after everything that happened." Daniel was silent for a moment, understanding in his eyes. He'd heard fragments of Quentin's war experiences over the years, enough to know there were shadows his younger brother carried. "And now?" Daniel finally asked. "Now," Quentin said, glancing through the window where he could see Katherine laughing with Sarah, "I want to build something good to balance the scales a bit." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "About damn time." The next day, Quentin took Katherine to see the Parson homestead. The small house sat nestled against a rise, partially sheltered from the wind by a stand of cottonwoods similar to those along the creek. A barn and corral stood nearby, along with a small garden plot. "It needs work," Quentin acknowledged as he helped Katherine down from the wagon. "New roof in places, some of the windows need reglazing, but the bones are solid." Katherine surveyed the property with bright eyes. "It's perfect, Quentin. Not too far from town for my teaching, close enough to Daniel's for your partnership to work." They explored the house together, 3 small rooms and a lean-to kitchen, simply built but with unexpected touches of craftsmanship in the stone fireplace and built-in shelving. "Old man Parson was a carpenter before he took up ranching," Quentin explained. "Put his mark on the place." Katherine ran her hand along a smoothly finished window frame. "I can see us here," she said softly, "making it our own." Quentin came to stand behind her, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "I've been thinking about timing," he said. "For the wedding." Katherine turned to face him. "Oh." "Spring would be traditional," Quentin continued. "Give us time to court properly, get the house ready, but, Katherine prompted when he hesitated. "But I was thinking Christmas might be nice," Quentin said. "If that's not too soon for you." Katherine's face lit with pleasure. "Christmas would be perfect, though Mrs. Foster will be scandalized by such a short courtship." Quentin chuckled. "Mrs. Foster's been leaving bridal magazines in your room for weeks. I think she'll survive the shock." The following weeks settled into a pleasant rhythm. Katherine began teaching at the small schoolhouse, quickly winning over both her students and their parents with her combination of Eastern education and practical approach. Quentin divided his time between Daniel's ranch and preparing the Parson homestead, making necessary repairs and improvements for their future home. Each evening, Quentin would escort Katherine on walks through town or along the creek, supporting her as she gradually rebuilt her strength. Her limp remained, but grew less pronounced as Dr. Wells had predicted. By November, she needed the walking stick only on uneven ground or when particularly tired. News of their Christmas wedding spread quickly through the small community. Sarah Calloway and Mrs. Foster took charge of the preparations, enlisting Catherine's help only for the most important decisions. Quentin found himself the recipient of good-natured teasing from the men in town, along with surprisingly earnest advice about married life. As the wedding approached, Quentin rode into town one crisp December afternoon with a special surprise. Katherine was just dismissing her students when he arrived at the schoolhouse, leading not only his own horse but a gentle, dappled mare. "What's this?" Katherine asked, coming down the steps carefully. "This is Belle," Quentin replied, patting the mare's neck. "She's for you." Katherine's eyes widened. "Quentin, I couldn't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "You'll need your own horse at the homestead. And Daniel says Belle here is the steadiest mount on the ranch. Even with your leg, you'll have no trouble riding her." Katherine approached the mare cautiously, allowing the animal to sniff her hand before stroking her soft nose. "She's beautiful," she admitted. "But how will we afford her?" "She's a wedding gift from Daniel and Sarah," Quentin explained. "And I thought perhaps you might like a riding lesson today." Katherine looked uncertain. "I haven't been on a horse since the accident." "I know," Quentin said, "but you trusted me when I said you'd walk again. Trust me now." After a moment's hesitation, Katherine nodded. "Always." With patient care, Quentin helped Katherine mount the mare, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her still healing leg. He led Belle at a gentle walk around the schoolyard, gradually allowing Katherine to take the reins herself. By the time the sun began to set, Katherine was guiding Belle in slow circles, a look of triumphant joy on her face that reminded Quentin of the first time she'd taken steps without support. "I'm doing it," she called, echoing those earlier words. "You surely are," Quentin replied, his heart full as he watched her overcome yet another limitation. That evening, as they sat together on the porch of Katherine's cabin, she turned to him with an expression of quiet contentment. "Thank you for today," she said. "For Belle, for the lesson, for—" She gestured vaguely, as if trying to encompass something larger than words could express. "For what?" Quentin prompted. "For never seeing me as broken," Katherine said finally. "From that first day in the dust, you've always looked at me and seen possibility, not limitation." Quentin took her hand, running his thumb across her knuckles. "That's because there's never been anything broken about your spirit, Katherine, not for a single moment." Their Christmas wedding was a community affair, with nearly every resident of Cottonwood Springs in attendance. The small church was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, warming the simple space against the winter chill outside. Katherine wore a dress of deep blue velvet, a gift from the women of the town, who had pooled their resources and talents to create something worthy of the occasion. With her auburn hair arranged in elegant curls and a small bouquet of winter berries in her hands, she took Quentin's breath away as she walked down the aisle. She used no cane or walking stick, though her limp was still visible. To Quentin, it only emphasized the strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning, the determination that had allowed her to survive when others might have surrendered to despair. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, exchanged before the community that had become family to them both. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the depth of his emotion. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice their number. Katherine and Quentin didn't stay until the end, slipping away as the festivities continued to begin the short journey to their homestead, their home. The house had been transformed in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Quentin had completed the repairs, while Sarah and other women from town had helped furnish it with a combination of practical necessities and thoughtful touches. A handmade quilt covered the bed, curtains hung at the windows, and a fire burned welcomingly in the hearth. As Quentin carried Katherine across the threshold, a tradition she had insisted upon despite her protests that her leg was strong enough for walking. They both felt the significance of the moment. This was no temporary shelter, no way station on a longer journey. This was the beginning of their shared life. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Katherine traced the lines of Quentin's face with gentle fingers. "Happy?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes. "Completely," she replied. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Quentin admitted. "You know, when I found you that day, I was running from commitment, from putting down roots anywhere. And now you're stuck with both," Katherine teased softly. "Not stuck," Quentin corrected, pulling her closer. "Finally free." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white that would melt with the spring thaw, bringing new growth to the plains. Inside, Quentin and Katherine Calloway drifted to sleep in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together, walking side by side as promised. Spring came early to Wyoming territory in 1879. By March, the snow had receded, leaving behind mud and the first tentative shoots of green. At the Calloway homestead, the season brought changes both to the land and to the young couple who had made their home there. Katherine's teaching position had proved even more rewarding than she'd anticipated. The children of Cottonwood Springs, from the youngest beginners to teenagers preparing for adult responsibilities, responded well to her blend of Eastern education and practical knowledge. Many of the older girls, in particular, found in her an example of a woman who valued both intellect and family, a balance they had rarely seen. Quentin's partnership with Daniel flourished as well. The brothers' complementary skills made for a successful operation. Daniel's steady management, paired with Quentin's innovative approaches to breeding and grazing. Their cattle were already fetching higher prices at market, and neighboring ranchers had begun asking for advice. On a warm Saturday in April, Quentin and Katherine rode together to town for supplies. Katherine had become a confident rider despite her lingering limp, and Belle proved to be the perfect mount for her, calm but spirited when encouraged. "Race you to the creek bend," Katherine called, surprising Quentin as she urged Belle into a canter. With a laugh, Quentin gave his stallion his head, though he purposely held back just enough to let Katherine reach the designated spot first. "You let me win," she accused as they slowed their horses to a walk. "Did no such thing," Quentin protested with mock indignation. "Belle's just faster than Old Thunder here." Katherine gave him a knowing look, but accepted the fiction with good grace. As they continued toward town at a more sedate pace, she grew thoughtful. "Quentin," she said after a while, "do you ever regret that we can't have children of our own?" The question caught him off guard. They hadn't discussed the matter since that day by the creek the previous autumn, when Katherine had revealed her condition. "No," he said honestly. "I meant what I said then. Having you in my life is enough." Katherine nodded, though something in her expression suggested there was more on her mind. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about what you said that day about there being children who need homes." Quentin slowed thunder further, giving her his full attention. "Go on." "Yesterday, Mrs. Jenkins told me about a situation in a town about 40 miles west of here," Katherine explained. "A family with 4 children lost both parents to influenza. The oldest is 12, the youngest just 2. The community's been caring for them, but no one can take all 4, and they're talking about separating them." Quentin studied his wife's face, seeing the mixture of compassion and hope in her eyes. "And you're thinking we might offer them a home, all 4? Katherine nodded, watching him carefully. "It's a lot to consider, I know. 4 children would change everything. But our house has the space with some adjustments. I'm already teaching, so the older ones would be with me during the day, and you're so good with Daniel's children." Quentin was quiet for a moment, considering the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Then he remembered something his mother had once told him. Family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who you choose to love. "When could we meet them?" he asked. The brilliance of Catherine's smile was answer enough to whether he'd made the right decision. "Really? You're willing to consider it?" "More than consider," Quentin replied, reaching across to take her hand. "If these children need a home and we have one to offer, seems like the right thing to do." Catherine squeezed his hand tightly. "Mrs. Jenkins said she could arrange for us to visit next week. The oldest is a boy named James. Then there are twin girls who are 9, and the little one is a girl named Elizabeth." The names made the children suddenly real to Quentin, not abstract concepts, but actual young people in need. "James, the twins, and Elizabeth," he repeated. "Well, they'd certainly liven up the homestead." "It won't be easy," Catherine acknowledged. "They've lost so much. They'll need time and patience." "Good thing they'll have a mother who has plenty of both," Quentin said warmly, "and a father who's learning." Catherine's eyes shimmered with emotion at his use of the words mother and father. They rode the rest of the way to town in companionable silence, both contemplating the new direction their lives might take. The following week, they traveled to the neighboring town and met the children. James was solemn and protective of his siblings, regarding Quentin and Catherine with wary hope. The twins, Emily and Alice, were quiet but watchful, clinging to each other's hands. Little Elizabeth, barely understanding what had happened to her parents, was the most openly accepting of the strangers who had come to meet them. After spending the day with the children, Quentin and Catherine discussed their impressions privately. "They're grieving," Catherine said softly. "Especially James. He's trying to be the man of the family already." Quentin nodded, remembering how the boy had positioned himself between his sisters and the newcomers until he determined they posed no threat. "Reminds me of Daniel after our father died. Took on too much, too young." "Do you think we can help them?" Catherine asked. "Truly help them heal?" Quentin considered the question seriously. "I think we can offer them safety, stability, and love. The healing will come in its own time." He paused, then added, "I think we should do this, Catherine. I think these children belong with us." The process of bringing the children to the homestead took several weeks of arrangements and preparations. Quentin added a second bedroom to the house, working long hours to complete it before their arrival. Catherine sewed bedding and curtains, and collected books and small toys she thought might ease the transition. The community of Cottonwood Springs rallied around them. Daniel and Sarah donated a milk cow and chickens to help feed the expanded family. The women of the town organized a household shower, providing everything from kitchen utensils to children's clothing. Even Dr. Wells contributed, providing thorough checkups for all 4 children and a supply of basic medicines. Finally, on a bright May morning, Quentin drove the wagon up to their homestead with Catherine beside him and 4 silent children in the back. James sat protectively near his sisters, his few possessions clutched in a small bundle. The twins held hands as always, their identical faces solemn beneath matching braids. Little Elizabeth, exhausted from the journey, slept in Catherine's lap. As they approached the house, Quentin glanced at his wife. "Ready for this?" Catherine nodded, her eyes reflecting both nervousness and determination. "As ready as any of us can be." The first weeks were challenging, as everyone adjusted to the new family arrangement. James remained guarded, watching Quentin's every interaction with his sisters as if expecting some betrayal. The twins were well behaved to the point of invisibility, speaking only when spoken to and completing chores with silent efficiency. Only Elizabeth seemed to adapt quickly, attaching herself to Katherine with the straightforward need of a toddler. Katherine's experience as a teacher proved invaluable. She established routines and expectations, offering the children the structure they desperately needed while giving them space to grieve. Quentin, less experienced with children, followed her lead while finding his own ways to connect with each child. For James, it was through work. Quentin invited the boy to help with the livestock, teaching him to milk the cow and care for the horses. Gradually, as James realized Quentin valued his assistance rather than merely tolerating it, the boy began to relax slightly in his presence. The twins proved more challenging to reach until Quentin discovered their fascination with his small collection of books. One evening, he found them peering at an illustrated volume of natural history. "Would you like me to read some to you?" he offered. The girls exchanged one of their silent communications, then nodded in unison. That began a nightly ritual reading together after dinner, sometimes stories, sometimes educational texts. Katherine would often join with Elizabeth on her lap, and occasionally even James would listen from his self-imposed distance near the door. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to function as a family. The children's initial wariness gave way to tentative trust, then to moments of genuine connection. The first time James called Quentin "Sir," without prompting, the first time the twins voluntarily showed Katherine a wildflower they'd found, the first time Elizabeth reached for Quentin instead of Katherine when she skinned her knee, each small milestone was celebrated privately between husband and wife. By high summer, the homestead had transformed. The garden flourished under Katherine's care, with the twins eagerly helping to tend the vegetables. James had proven himself skilled with animals, taking on increasing responsibility for the small herd of cattle Quentin was building. Elizabeth toddled everywhere, chattering constantly in her developing language, bringing life and laughter to spaces that had once been quiet. One evening in August, as Katherine sat on the porch mending a tear in one of James's shirts, Quentin settled beside her after putting the younger children to bed. "James asked me something today," he said, keeping his voice low. Katherine glanced up from her sewing. "Oh." "He wanted to know if they could call us mother and father," Quentin said. "Said the little ones are getting confused with all the different names." Katherine's hands stilled. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd need to discuss it with you," Quentin replied. "But that we'd be honored if they felt ready for that." Katherine was quiet for a moment, emotion visible in her eyes. "I never thought I'd hear those words," she admitted softly. "Mother, it seemed impossible after what the doctors told me." Quentin took her hand, careful of the needle she still held. "Just proves what I've known all along. There's no limitation that can stand against Katherine Calloway when she sets her mind to something." Katherine smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "We did it, didn't we? Built something good here." "We're still building," Quentin corrected gently. "But yes, it's good, better than I ever imagined possible." As if summoned by their conversation, James appeared in the doorway. At 12, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, tall for his age, with serious eyes that had seen too much too young. "Sir?" "Madam," he said hesitantly, "the twins had a bad dream they're asking for Mother." Katherine and Quentin exchanged a glance, a lifetime of meaning passing between them in that brief moment. "I'll go to them," Katherine said, setting aside her mending and rising to her feet. Her limp was barely noticeable now, though it would always remain a part of her stride, a reminder of the journey that had brought them all together. As she passed James, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for looking out for your sisters, James. You're a good brother." The boy ducked his head, but not before Quentin caught the flicker of pride in his eyes. As Katherine disappeared into the house, James lingered on the porch, his posture suggesting he had more to say. "Something else on your mind, son?" Quentin asked. James hesitated, then took a seat on the porch step near Quentin's chair. "I've been thinking about my name," he said after a moment. "Your name," Quentin repeated, curious. "The twins and Elizabeth. They're young enough that they might forget our old last name eventually," James explained. "But I never will. I don't want to forget my father." Quentin nodded in understanding. "You shouldn't forget him. He'll always be part of who you are." "But I was thinking," James continued, "maybe I could be James Wilson Calloway, keep my father's name in the middle, but—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "But be a Calloway too," Quentin finished for him, deeply touched by the boy's suggestion. "I think that would be a fine way to honor both your past and your future, James." The boy nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Thank you, Father." The word hung in the air between them, new and yet somehow already familiar. Quentin reached out and placed a hand on James's shoulder, much as Katherine had done moments before. "Thank you, son," he replied simply. As the stars emerged above the Wyoming plains, father and son sat in companionable silence on the porch of the home they were building together, not just the physical structure, but the bonds of family forged through choice rather than blood. Inside, Katherine's voice could be heard softly soothing the twins, promising that bad dreams could not harm them here, that they were safe and loved. Elizabeth's gentle snores provided a counterpoint from the small bed she had recently graduated to from her crib. And Quentin Calloway, who had once been a drifter without direction, felt the profound weight of his blessings. From a chance encounter in the dust had grown this life, this family, all because he had stopped for a wounded stranger and made a promise he intended to keep for all his days. The years flowed like the creek beside their property, sometimes rushing, sometimes gentle, but always moving forward. By 1885, the Calloway homestead had grown from a modest beginning to a thriving small ranch. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and a proper barn now stood where once there had been only a simple corral. James, at 18, had developed into a fine young man with his father's build and his own quiet confidence. He worked alongside Quentin as a full partner in the ranch operations, showing a particular talent for horse breeding that promised to become a profitable venture of its own. The twins, Emily and Alice, had blossomed into bright 15-year-olds who excelled in Katherine's classroom and helped with the younger children at home. Though still close, they had developed distinct personalities, Emily drawn to books and learning, Alice more interested in practical skills like cooking and sewing. 8-year-old Elizabeth, who remembered nothing of her life before the Calloways, filled the house with song and laughter. She had Quentin wrapped firmly around her finger, a fact that amused Katherine to no end. And there were new additions as well. 2 years after the children had come to them, Katherine and Quentin had taken in a newborn baby boy whose mother had died in childbirth, and whose father, a local miner, had been killed in a cave in the month before. They named him Daniel, after Quentin's brother, and he was now a rambunctious 6-year-old who idolized James and tried to follow him everywhere. The youngest Calloway was 3-year-old Hope, daughter of a young woman who had passed through town and given birth at Mrs. Foster's hotel before disappearing in the night. The note she left asked only that her child be given to the teacher with the kind eyes and her cowboy husband. No one had ever questioned that the baby belonged with the Calloways, 6 children in a home that had once seemed destined to remain childless. Katherine sometimes marveled at the twists of fate that had brought them all together. Her leg, though long healed, still ached before storms, a small price to pay, She often thought, for the life she had found. Cottonwood Springs had grown as well, though it remained a small town by most standards. Catherine's school now had a proper building with 3 classrooms and 2 additional teachers, one of whom was Emily, who had begun as Catherine's assistant while still a student herself. On a crisp October afternoon, as Catherine walked home from school with Daniel and Hope, she spotted a familiar figure waiting at the crossroads. Quentin on horseback, still as handsome to her eyes as he had been that first day in the dust. "Well now," he called as they approached, "if it isn't my favorite schoolteacher and her entourage." "Papa," Hope squealed, breaking free from Catherine's hand and running toward him. Quentin swung down from his horse and scooped the little girl up in one smooth motion, settling her in front of him as he remounted. "And how was your day, Miss Hope?" "I drawed a horse," she announced proudly. "Teacher says it's the best horse ever." "Is that so?" Quentin replied seriously. "Better than thunder?" Hope considered this grave question. "Maybe tie," she decided diplomatically. Catherine laughed, taking Daniel's hand as they continued toward home. "And what brings you to town in the middle of the day, Mr. Calloway?" "Telegram came," Quentin replied, his expression brightening. "James got accepted to that veterinary school in Denver, full scholarship." Catherine's face lit with joy. "Oh, that's wonderful news. He's worked so hard." "He has," Quentin agreed, pride evident in his voice. "Came straight to town when it arrived. He's over at Daniel and Sarah's now, telling the cousins." They continued home together, discussing plans for a celebration dinner. As they crested the small rise that gave them their first view of the homestead, Catherine paused for a moment, taking in the scene below. The house stood solid and welcoming, smoke curling from the chimney where Alice would be preparing dinner. The barn and outbuildings formed a protective cluster nearby, and cattle grazed peacefully in the adjacent pasture. It was a picture of prosperity and security, everything she had dreamed of, as she dragged herself through the dust all those years ago. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Quentin asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Catherine smiled up at him, the afternoon sun catching the strands of silver that had begun to appear among her auburn hair. "I was just thinking about promises kept." Quentin's eyes softened with understanding. After handing Hope down to her brother, he dismounted and came to stand beside his wife. "You're walking beside me," he said softly, taking her hand. "I am," Catherine agreed, "in every way that matters." As they continued down the path toward home, surrounded by the family they had built together, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners in life's greatest adventure, they had created something neither could have imagined alone. And as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Katherine Zimmerman Calloway walked steadily beside her cowboy, just as he had promised she would on that fateful day when he found her limp and alone in the dust.